What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the CUPPS Analytics YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to be giving you guys my breakdown of all the data-driven takeaways I have from Week 8 of the 2025 NFL season. This week was pretty insane. Looking back on it, we had some insane scoring. We had the highest PPR score of any player of the season so far, and we had some brutal injuries as well. So I'm going to be taking you guys through my biggest data-driven takeaways from all the games we saw on Sunday of this past week, talking about the biggest risers and fallers, the biggest buys, the biggest sells, along with just a macro view of the overall fantasy landscape through the first 8 weeks of the 25 season. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the first chart that we're going to be looking at. Welcome to the Week 8 CUPPS Analytics Data Breakdown. Here we go. We'll start off here with the first chart, the top 10 risers and fallers at the running back position. So if you haven't seen this chart before, basically what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the biggest differences in fantasy points per game before the current week and after the current week is included. So you can see here at the top 10 green running backs are the running backs that had their fantasy points per game position rank increase by the largest amounts after including their week 9 fantasy points. So what this chart does is it gives us a good idea of players that see a drastic change in their utilization in the current week compared to previous weeks that they performed. So far this year, it's done a pretty good job of bringing up names that you could see as good waiver wire candidates or good adds to your fantasy rosters, because it does an especially good job of isolating players with smaller sample sizes. For example, players that maybe were healthy scratches for the first couple games of the year or were injured and only have a couple games included in their fantasy points per game sample size. So typically there are some pretty solid takeaways just looking at this chart for running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends every week. So jumping in with the top riser at the running back position this week, we have Tyrell Jennings in New England. With Ramondre Stevenson inactive this week, Tyrell Jennings pretty much jumped into that short yardage bruiser back role, directly what Ramondre would be playing if he were active. As much as the Travion Henderson fans wanted to see a complete takeover of this backfield, it seems like Vrabel and the New England coaching staff are pretty set on having a two-headed monster in this backfield right now. So even if Ramondre is not active, I think we're going to be seeing a healthy dose of Tyrell Jennings going forward. He had 11 carries to Travion Henderson's 14, but he did only have one target to Travion Henderson's 6. I haven't heard much on the extent or severity of Ramondre's injury, but if he is sidelined another week, then I think Tyrell Jennings would definitely be worth a waiver wire pickup and would fit right in as, a mid RB3. Jumping down a couple lines, we have Chris Rodriguez out of Washington. In their game against the Seahawks this week, Rodriguez had 12 carries, which was the exact same amount that we got from Jacory Krosky-Merritt, so they split that backfield essentially evenly. There's honestly not anyone in this backfield that I'm super interested in anymore, especially with Jayden Daniels probably being out for the season. So not super interested in picking up Chris Rodriguez. I think what it more so says is that we can't really be trusting Bill anymore. Jump down a little further, we have Kyle Monangai in Chicago. Monangai went absolutely bonkers this game with DeAndre Swift sidelined. He had 26 carries for 176 yards and added 3 catches for 22 yards. And I think even if we do see Swift back next week, Monangai's earned a share of this backfield in Chicago. The Bears have pretty much lacked any sort of substantial run offense this entire year up until this game, and Monangai came in and provided that spark that they've been looking for weeks. So while I do think Swift will obviously play a role in this backfield, he's obviously a super talented pass catcher, I think we can see Monangai here with 15 to 20 carries on a weekly basis and potentially some of the red zone work as well. So if he's on your waiver wire, I'm absolutely interested in picking him up, using the first overall waiver claim on him. He seems like he could be a plug and play RB2 down the stretch. Next, we have RJ Harvey, who raises his fantasy points per game from 9.9 to around 10.7, and he's up to RB26 in fantasy points per game now. And Harvey just keeps getting there week after week, even though he only gets 2 to 5 carries on a weekly basis, which is pretty crazy. This week, he only had 2 carries for 5 yards, but he led the team in catches with 5 catches for 51 yards. So with Harvey, I feel like we're getting to the point where he is a pretty reliable starter on a week-to-week basis, even though he's getting a pretty absurdly low percentage of the carries out of the backfield. They seem to absolutely love him in the red zone. They love him on passing downs out of the backfield. And I think he's established himself a pretty safe floor with his receiving upside. We also see Rico Dowdle raising his fantasy points per game up to 14.6 on a weekly basis. He's up to RB 16 on the year in fantasy points per game. And we had some coach speak before this week from Dave Canales saying they were planning on turning over the reins of the backfield to Rico Dowdle rather than Chuba Hubbard. They were saying he'd earned that 1A spot. And there were definitely some question marks as to whether that was actually going to be true or was it just classic coach speak. And Canales put his money where his mouth is. He gave Rico Dowdle 25 carries, who was good for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. In contrast, Chuba Hubbard only had 5 carries for 17 yards. So I think it's safe to say that Rico Dowdle is now a locked and loaded starter. He should never be leaving your lineup. He's going to be leading this Panthers backfield on a weekly basis. And he also just looks insanely good. He looks like a super talented running back, which was not something that I would have thought that I'd be saying this year, but he's absolutely earned everything he's gotten in this Panthers backfield, and I'll be viewing Rico Dowdle as a weekly back-end RB1 starter going forward. Also, just a quick note on Kaleb Johnson, who finds himself in the risers list this week. Absolutely nothing crazy, but he made a big step by not being a healthy scratch, which we love to see for a rookie. He only had 2 carries and 1 catch, so obviously not a super meaningful role in the Steelers backfield right now, but it is a step in the right direction from being a healthy scratch over the past couple weeks or being active and just not seeing the field other than special teams plays. So I wouldn't be picking up Kaleb Johnson yet. We still haven't seen anywhere near enough for him to be fantasy relevant. He's clearly behind Kenneth Gainwell and Jaylen Warren still in that pecking order. But just a name to keep an eye on. He was an intriguing prospect, and if we see an injury to Warren or Gainwell, then I think he would definitely be worth a stash. Jumping down to the running back fallers, not a ton that I want to take away from this list. The one name I did want to bring up was Brassard Smith, who we've seen just a complete downfall from over the past couple weeks compared to how Kansas City was using him earlier in the season. Earlier on, Smith was looking like he was going to be a receiving weapon out of this backfield for KC, but he hasn't even gotten a reception out of this KC backfield over the past couple weeks. In week 9, he had 3 carries for 7 yards and didn't haul in his 1 target. And in a game where KC was trailing pretty much the whole time, we were hoping to see potentially more Brassard Smith. Maybe he would emerge as a true receiving threat that we were hoping for. So I think Brassard Smith is firmly droppable in all redraft formats at this point. All right, jumping over to the top 10 risers and fallers at the wide receiver position. We'll start off with Demario Douglas, who is up to wide receiver 67 in fantasy points per game on the year. He goes 4 for 100 with a touchdown this week. Kayshon Boutte left this game early, so I think Demario Douglas kind of assumed that role of the big play threat in this offense. But I think all of these Patriots wide receivers kind of see an inconsistent, unreliable, boom-bust role from week to week. Tory Horton, on the other hand, is a player that I would definitely be interested in adding if he's available in your league. Horton goes 4 for 48 and 2 touchdowns in the Sunday Night Football game against the Commanders this week. Horton had a prospect profile that definitely stood out to me, and he looked to me like a prospect that could really make an impact at the NFL level. So this is my prospect write-up of Horton from the past summer. If you're interested in reading this, just go ahead and pause the video. But I definitely think we could be due for a Tory Horton second half breakout this year. With Cooper Kupp always banged up and Father Time not on his side anymore, I think there's a solid chance we see Tory Horton step into this wide receiver 2 role for the Seahawks, who look to have one of the best passing offenses in the entire league right now. In terms of wide receiver risers, the most fantasy relevant one that we're seeing here is absolutely T. Higgins, who's up to 12.9 fantasy points per game on the year, which is good for wide receiver 30. He goes absolutely nuclear this week against the Bears. 7 catches, 121 yards, and 2 touchdowns through the air. And honestly, it's just good to see some of the Joe Flacco boost to this Bengals offense going T. Higgins' way, when over the past couple weeks it looked like it was pretty much exclusive to Jamar Chase. So this definitely gives me more hope starting T. Higgins on a weekly basis going forward. We're also seeing DJ Moore here, who's up to wide receiver 40 in fantasy points per game on the year, and I still have a hard time getting super excited about DJ Moore. We saw a trick play passing touchdown from him this week, which boosts those fantasy points. Playing his normal wide receiver role, we still only saw 4 catches for 72 yards, which is obviously good but not great. More of a mid wide receiver 3 at this point, and I'm having a hard time getting him much higher than that. Moving over to the wide receiver fallers for this week, not a ton to take away here either, but the name I wanted to bring up was Jaylin Noel. With Christian Kirk returning to the lineup along with Nico Collins, we saw Jaylin Noel pretty much go entirely invisible this week. He has 0 catches, 0 targets, and 1 carry for -3 yards. Similar stuff could be said for the other rookie, Jayden Higgins, who had 1 catch for 4 yards. So it seems like this Houston coaching staff is more interested in getting their veterans involved, like Christian Kirk, Xavier Hutchinson, than their 2 promising young rookies who we had high hopes for post Houston bye, but it's not looking like it's going to be happening for either of those rookies anytime soon. Jumping over to the top risers and fallers at the tight end position, we definitely have some important names to talk about here. At the top of the list, we have Colston Loveland, who goes absolutely bonkers in this game against the Bengals. We finally see the Loveland breakout game. He goes 6 for 118 and 2 touchdowns this week. And this connection with Caleb Williams is exactly what we were looking for from Loveland this past offseason when we were drafting him. It's no secret how big of a fan I was of Loveland's prospect profile coming into the NFL. You can see my prospect write-up from him this past summer. If you want to pause the video and read the whole thing, go ahead and do so. But to keep it brief, Loveland is one of the best tight end prospects since 2014 in my model. In fact, he's the 3rd best of several hundred tight end prospects, coming in only behind Kyle Pitts and Brock Bowers. And you can see at the bottom of this tweet, there are a ton of promising names in terms of his range of outcomes of similar prospects that have come into the NFL. So this was absolutely awesome to see from Loveland. This was the breakout game that we were looking for, and it's restored my hope in what we could see from him potentially this year. I think there's a good chance he's on a lot of waiver wires now, given the fact that he was underperforming so terribly to start the year, and he would absolutely be someone I'd be interested in picking up wherever I could. Obviously, they were playing against the Bengals defense, so we have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I do believe that we'll continue to see Loveland evolve into one of Caleb Williams' top options in this passing game throughout the season. Given the upside that we just saw, I think he is a plug and play back in tight end 1 at the worst at this point. We also see that we have Brock Bowers here, 3rd largest tight end riser on the week. He's up from 10.3 fantasy points per game all the way up to 17 fantasy points per game, jumping him from the tight end 14 in fantasy points per game up to the tight end 1. So probably one of the more insane rises I've seen out of any player this year. And this was always the case with Brock Bowers. I brought him up as a potential buy candidate in one of my past videos. The question was never about the talent. It was always about whether we were going to see him come back fully healthy. And I think the Raiders played this absolutely perfectly, making him sit the week before the bye. They had the week 8 bye, and then he comes into week 9 looking like the Brock Bowers that we knew from last year and in week 1. And the Brock Bowers that we know is the best tight end in the NFL and arguably just one of the best pass catchers in general. So I think this game clearly was a statement to answer any questions that we had left about what Brock Bowers is going to be this year. And he's firmly back to my tight end 1 the rest of season. He's looking absolutely electric, fully healthy, looking like the engine for this entire Las Vegas passing offense. And if you were able to acquire him while he was hurt or while he was on bye, then I applaud you because I think your team just became a favorite this year. Or if you were somehow able to hold on to him and take the 0 for the past couple weeks and your team isn't completely in the dumpster, then I think you have a real significant chance of making a run over the second half of the year. I also wanted to note, we are seeing another 2025 rookie make this list. Terrance Ferguson, now up to 5.15 fantasy points per game on the year. So obviously nothing too crazy, but he is getting more involved in this Rams offense, which is great to see. I will say though, looking at the box score, he still isn't separating from the other tight ends on this Rams roster. Tyler Higbee had 3 catches of his own, Davis Allen had 3 catches, and Colby Parkinson had 2 catches. So while Terrance Ferguson got involved, he went 2 for 54 this week. He's still right around all those other tight ends, and it still feels pretty hard to figure out which one is going to emerge as the main pass catcher, if any, this year. So I wouldn't say I'm looking to pick up Terrance Ferguson right now in redraft, but a name to keep an eye on over the coming weeks if we continue to see him take a step forward in that tight end room. In terms of tight end followers, just a bunch of mid this week, so gonna skip over these guys. All right, jumping down to our second chart of the night, we're looking at the top 24 breakdown of players sorted by expected fantasy points per game, starting off with the running back position. So if you haven't seen this chart before, it pulls in PFF's expected fantasy points, which basically tells us how much are these players expected to score based on their utilization in their offenses. So the blue bars here represent the expected fantasy point production, and then the red and the green dashed lines leading to the dots show the deltas between that player's expected fantasy point production and their actual fantasy point production. So if the player has a green dot to the right of their expected fantasy points, that means they're overperforming their expectation. And then you can see the delta between actual and expected fantasy points in the parentheses here. And then on the flip side, if that player has a red dot to the left of their expected fantasy points, that means they are underperforming their expectation. So starting off here with Christian McCaffrey, the man at the top of the list. He's been there since week 1 and continues to just absolutely lap the field at the running back position. He's the only running back above that 20 point per game threshold for expected fantasy points, and he's all the way up at 25.64, where the next closest running back, Jonathan Taylor at RB2, is at 18. So he is over 7 points expected higher than any other running back in the NFL. And it really just goes to show how valuable that receiving work that Christian McCaffrey gets is in terms of fantasy production. I say it every week, but Christian McCaffrey is and will be my RB1 rest of season all the way as long as he's healthy. The upside he offers is truly unlike any other running back at the position. I've seen people put Jonathan Taylor above him. I cannot be doing that. That seems crazy to me. I mean, as good as JT is, it's like the difference in the expectation for both of these guys and the floor for both of these guys is absolutely crazy. I mean, CMC is literally playing 2 positions, especially in a PPR league, but even in half PPR. The difference for Christian McCaffrey is just astronomical. So he's my RB1. He will be my RB1. And if you have him, you are at a significant advantage to win your fantasy championship this year. We could talk about the aforementioned Jonathan Taylor as well. He has his first down game of the year. Pittsburgh Steelers actually found something to keep Jonathan Taylor from hitting his ceiling, and that was getting the Colts into a negative game script quick. It looks like when the Colts are forced into that negative or neutral game script, we will see a major difference in how Jonathan Taylor is utilized, the amount of touches he will get, and just his overall ceiling in general. I don't think it changes a ton for me in terms of the JT outlook the rest of the year. I do think he is my RB2 rest of season, but it was definitely interesting to see that this is in JT's range of outcomes on a weekly basis. Josh Jacobs at the RB3 spot, I mean, he just scores 1 million touchdowns. He gets pretty much every carry out of this backfield. He was a little injured this week with a calf injury, so the backfield was split up a little bit more. Emmanuel Wilson got more of the carries than normal. So that's something to keep an eye on, but at the end of the day, I think you're plugging in Josh Jacobs as a high-end RB1. He doesn't look like the same talent as a player like Jonathan Taylor, obviously, but his usage and his expectation is at the top of the league in terms of fantasy production. So continuing to plug in Josh Jacobs as a high-end RB1. He finds the end zone in nearly every game, once, if not more. We saw Bijan with a little bit of a disappointing game this week. It was a little tilting seeing 3 goal line stands all go to Drake London touchdowns rather than Bijan touchdowns. But at the end of the day, that's just kind of how the usage goes. There will be days where all 3 of those go to Bijan as well. So his usage is still at the top of the league. He looks like one of the most talented backs in the league, and continuing to fire up Bijan as a high-end RB1 on a weekly basis. Jumping down a little bit, we see Chase Brown making a jump back up in his expected fantasy points per game. Before this week, Chase Brown was down, I believe, around RB 18 to 20 in terms of expected fantasy points per game. He's now up to RB 10. Chase Brown had a massive game this week, and not as much in the box score, but pretty much in every other way that you could look at it from the data perspective. One, Samaje Perine left the game early with an injury. And if you've been listening to these videos over the past couple weeks, you'll know that, in my opinion, Samaje Perine is probably the biggest threat to Chase Brown's upside this year. But with him leaving early with an injury, we saw Chase Brown take over the entirety of the backfield like he was doing last year, like he was doing at the beginning of this year. And he finishes this game with 11 rushes for 37 yards, which is obviously pretty mid. But the important thing, he finishes this game with 14 targets and 8 catches for 75 yards. So he led the team in targets with 14, which is absolutely nuts for a running back. And if Chase Brown's gonna continue to get this usage, I will absolutely eat my words and bring him back into my top 10 running backs for the rest of the season. I still don't really think he's an awesome back in terms of his talent, but 14 targets in fantasy is something you simply can't ignore, especially for a running back. And it looks like we've established a pretty safe floor with Chase Brown with extreme upside if he is able to get into the end zone more often. Right below Chase Brown, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, who's all the way down at RB11 in expected fantasy points per game. Pretty brutal run out this week. Not what you like to see from Jahmyr Gibbs. He only has 9 carries to David Montgomery's 11, and he only has 3 targets and 3 catches. Honestly, this just feels like coaching malpractice to me in this game. For the Lions to be trailing the entire time and to prioritize David Montgomery over Jahmyr Gibbs, especially not prioritizing Jahmyr Gibbs in the passing game where he's super effective. I'm not really sure what Dan Campbell and the coaching staff was thinking in this one. So hopefully the loss kind of knocks some sense into them and they reprioritize their running back carries and targets out of the backfield. Jumping down a little bit, I did want to make a quick note on Kimani Vidal, who moves down quite a bit in expected fantasy points per game. He's now down to RB19 on the year at 13.1 expected fantasy points per game. He's underperforming that slightly at 11.2. And this game definitely tempered my expectations for Vidal a little bit without Omarion Hampton. After the previous week where he just ran all over the Minnesota Vikings, I was pretty excited with Kimani Vidal and thinking that I'd be firing him up as a back-end RB1 as long as Omarion Hampton was inactive. But this game we saw a little bit of a shakeup in that backfield. We saw Vidal get 12 carries for 30 yards and Jarrett Patterson, elevated from the practice squad, gets 9 carries for 44 yards. So it was a much more even split back there than what we saw in the previous game against the Vikings. Rather than Kimani Vidal workhorse season, it was more of a 50-50 split. Just definitely not what you want to see against the Titans defense that just gave up like 240 yards rushing to Jonathan Taylor in the previous game. So I'm still firing up Kimani Vidal as like a mid-range RB2 until Hampton's back, but definitely tempering expectations a little bit now that we've seen that this backfield can become a split. Jumping on down to the top 24 wide receivers by expected fantasy points per game, you can see Ja'Marr Chase remains at the top of the list. He's at 20.2 expected fantasy points per game, the only wide receiver above that 20-point threshold. He has a pretty classic Ja'Marr Chase floor game, and considering he's Ja'Marr Chase, that floor is pretty awesome. He goes 6 for 111 and no touchdown. So gun to my head, if I had to pick one wide receiver to be wide receiver 1 overall by fantasy points per game for the rest of the season, it's probably still going to be Ja'Marr Chase, but if it wasn't, it would absolutely be the guy right below him, Puka Nacua, who we see return from injury after the bye and go right back to being the Puka Nacua that we know. It's also just so awesome to see the fact that the wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 overall in expected fantasy points per game are both the Rams wide receivers, Puka and Davante. So Matt Stafford just absolutely king-making both of these guys, consolidating that entire passing offense through the best 2 options. So absolutely love to see it for fantasy. Additionally, we get a massive Drake London game. He's up to wide receiver 5 in expected fantasy points on the year at 18 roughly. He's overperforming that slightly at 19.4. I will say it's a little surprising to me to see Jackson Smith and Jigba down here below Amon-Ra St. Brown, below Rashid Rice, Drake London, CeeDee Lamb. I think all these guys are kind of in a similar pocket here in terms of their week-to-week upside. But it really does surprise me to see JSN down here at 16.8 expected fantasy points per game. I feel like he should be much higher, kind of up near the Puka and Ja'Marr Chase levels. So not really sure what PFF isn't seeing there in terms of JSN's usage. I do see him more as a super high-end wide receiver 1 rather than a mid to back-end wide receiver 1, but just something interesting to note there. Moving down a little bit here, I did want to call out Troy Franklin, who's at wide receiver 23 in expected fantasy points per game, and it's really starting to feel like we've seen a little bit of a changing of the guard in terms of that wide receiver 1 in Denver right now. So this week, Franklin does have a down game. He goes 4 for 27 and no touchdown, but he does have 10 targets, which leads the team, with the second highest target count on the team being Courtland Sutton with 6. So Franklin would definitely be a wide receiver that I'd be looking to buy into if I could after this week, coming off a down week where he didn't score a ton of points. I do think that we will start to see him continue to take over that wide receiver 1 role from Courtland Sutton. They obviously play pretty different positions, with Sutton being more of the big play threat and the red zone target, while Troy Franklin is more of a high volume receiver. But I think we absolutely could see Troy Franklin end up in that mid wide receiver 2 range down the stretch. All right, jumping down to the top 24 tight ends by expected fantasy points per game. We're going to skip over Trey McBride. We're going to skip over Jake Ferguson because this is being recorded before Monday Night Football. So the first name I want to talk about here is actually Kyle Pitts, who comes in as the tight end 6, but basically the tight end 5, considering we'll skip Alberto. And Kyle Pitts has just really shown that he has a solid floor amongst a pretty terrible tight end position this year. This week he got 7 targets, 4 catches for 38 yards. So obviously nothing that's going to blow away the stat sheet, but this is really the first year where he's emerged as one of the primary targets in this Falcons offense. Last year, both London and Mooney were above him, and this year he seems to have really passed Darnell Mooney for that number 2 spot. So I definitely think there's big games in potential for Kyle Pitts this year, and he's firmly in my mid to back end tight end 1s at this point. Also, a quick note on Oronde Gadsden, who just continues to do what we're accustomed to see him do in this Chargers offense. He goes 5 for 68 and no touchdown. Pretty solid floor week if you ask me for an up-and-coming rookie tight end. And in all honesty, I think there's a serious case to be made for Oronde Gadsden being as high as the tight end 3 in Dynasty. I know that may sound crazy. I think Bowers and McBride are both locks above him, but I think Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland, Tucker Kraft, and Oronde Gadsden. I honestly would not blame you if you had Gadsden over all of those guys. Speaking of Tucker Kraft, just an absolutely brutal end to his season, which was off to such an amazing start. He is out for the season with a torn ACL. He immediately becomes one of my biggest buys in Dynasty. If you can get him from a contender that needs plug and play tight end production, I'd absolutely be looking to send out offers for Tucker Kraft. All right, jumping into our third and final chart of the video. This one is the top 10 overperformers and underperformers at each position, starting off with the running backs here. So this chart also looks at the expected fantasy points per game that PFF gives us, like we saw in chart number 2. But instead of looking at it from the lens of the top 24 at each position, this time we're looking at the biggest deltas across every position between their actual and expected fantasy points per game. So I like to use this chart as a good gauge of the biggest buys or sells at each position. And not every player that is underperforming here would be a buy. Same thing goes for the overperformers. Not everyone that's overperforming would be a sell, but it does show us the biggest discrepancies between the actual and the expected fantasy points per game and allows us to use that as context when determining these players. So you can see here on the x-axis, we have the position rank delta. So that's what's determining overperformance versus underperformance. If a player is exceeding their expected position ranking by a large degree, so that would be, for example, these green bars right here where they have a positive position rank delta, that would indicate that they're overperforming. And on the flip side, if a player has an actual position rank that is lower than their expected position rank, indicating they would have a negative position rank delta, that means that they are underperforming. So starting off here with the biggest underperforming running back being Alvin Kamara, who is currently the RB36, expected to be the RB22. And Kamara's been underperforming this entire year on this chart. He's been one of the top 3 for as long as I can remember over the past couple weeks. And he's definitely not doing himself any favors in terms of capitalizing on his underperformances. I'm starting to have a hard time seeing how Alvin Kamara is going to get there this year. With the return of Taysom Hill, he's taking a large share of the rushes now. This week, Taysom had 4 carries to Alvin Kamara's 6. Additionally, Devin Neal added 3 of his own carries as well. And he's just not doing it in the receiving game like he used to. He only got 1 target this week for 3 yards and obviously no touchdown. At this point, I'm having a hard time seeing Alvin Kamara as anything more than a desperate flex option. Chase Brown, on the other hand, we talked about him a little bit earlier. He is the RB22, but expected to be the RB9. And like I mentioned earlier, I do see his role getting consistently better with Flacco at the helm and Samaje Perine now being hurt. So I'm definitely interested to see what Chase Brown can do over the coming weeks. In terms of overperformers here, the biggest one we have would be James Cook, who is the RB6, but expected to be the RB14. I don't think there's a ton to say about Cook. I just see him as more of a mid to back end RB1 than the high end RB1 that some people were projecting after the first couple weeks this year. I also mentioned Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt a little bit earlier. I think if you could sell him for anything, maybe based on the preseason hype still, I would absolutely be interested in doing so. I think the hopes for this Washington offense this year are pretty much shot at this point with Jayden Daniels out for the long run and with Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt basically splitting the backfield with Chris Rodriguez and losing the passing work to Jeremy McNichols. Moving over to the top 10 overperforming and underperforming wide receivers, starting with the underperformers here. This entire pocket of underperforming wide receivers outside of Alec Pierce would be players that I'd be interested in buying. Hetero McMillan, Brian Thomas Jr., Troy Franklin, Vlad McConkey, Rashid Shaheed, Nico Collins, Chris Olave, Davante Adams, and Keenan Allen. I think all of those players are great buys in their own ways. One guy I wanted to bring up in particular was Chris Olave, who is now down to wide receiver 17, but expected to be the wide receiver 10. I will say this expectation has fallen pretty drastically over the last couple weeks. With Tyler Shuck taking over at quarterback, we've seen a pretty insane fall off in Chris Olave's role in that Saints passing offense from what it was with Spencer Rattler. So while Chris Olave, I do believe, is still a solid buy, I don't view him like I was viewing him a couple weeks ago when he was the wide receiver 2 overall in expected fantasy points per game. He's now fallen to a more reasonable wide receiver 10 in expected fantasy points per game, and I do hope that Shuck begins to target Olave like we were seeing Rattler do, but it's definitely just something interesting to note about that Saints passing offense with a different quarterback at the helm. On the flip side of that, we have Rashid Shaheed, who looks at this point to be Shuck's favorite target. So I think there are definitely worse options that you could find other than Rashid Shaheed now with Tyler Shuck at quarterback. On the flip side, looking at the wide receiver overperformers, these four at the top here, DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, Jaylen Waddle, and Khalil Shakir would probably be my favorite sells among the wide receiver position. T. Higgins specifically, coming off of this massive game, I would be looking to capitalize on him if I could right now. Finishing off here with the top 10 overperforming and underperforming tight ends. I've already talked about Kyle Pitts as one of my favorite buys among the underperforming tight ends. Other ones I'd be interested in would be Harold Fannin, Tyler Warren, Travis Kelce, and obviously Trey McBride as well, but he's not much of an underperformer. In terms of the tight end overperformers, the biggest sell here that I would point out would definitely be Sam Laporta. He's coming off a massive game where he scored 22 fantasy points and had a long 40-yard touchdown, but I still think it's going to be hard for Laporta to find an every week reliable role in this Lions offense that proves to be super fantasy relevant. As you can see here, he's the tight end 11 currently, but expected to be the tight end 22 in expected fantasy points per game. So pretty big discrepancy there, and for a player that's name obviously carries a lot of weight, he would definitely be someone I'd be looking to throw into trades right now. All right, that's everything for the Week 8 data-driven takeaways from CUPPS Analytics. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Drop a comment below. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see different moving forward. If there are any other data visualizations that you think would be cool, let me know and I'd love to cook those up for you. As always, appreciate the support of the channel. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a like on the video, it helps a ton. Share this with your friends and league mates. And that's all I have for you guys this week. Thanks again for watching. I will see you in the next one.